Thick, yellowish pus oozed from the swollen mass beneath the king's jaw, spilling in warm rivulets down his neck and soaking into the linen of his nightshirt. The smell, rotting flesh, infected tissue, and the metallic tang of blood hung so heavily in the air that even seasoned attendants retched as they crossed the chamber. When the abscess burst, he woke choking, drowning in his own decay, clawing weakly at sheets already stiff with dried discharge. This was not a battlefield injury. This was not the work of an enemy blade. This was the slow, internal collapse of a crowned body, dissolving from the face inward. For days, no one spoke his name aloud in that room. The chamber was kept shuttered, not for privacy, but to contain the stench. Beeswax candles burned constantly in a futile attempt to mask it. Linen was changed again and again, only to be fouled within hours by the ceaseless flow of pus and saliva. The king could no longer close his mouth. His lower face had swollen and distorted beyond recognition, the skin stretched tight and glossy in some places, split open and blackened in others. On the left side, the flesh had begun to die. Every swallow was agony, every breath was laboured, and every meal placed before him was met with terror. He refused to eat. Not because he could not feel hunger. He could. Not because food was unavailable. France still fed its king. He refused because he was convinced that every cup, every morsel, every spoonful carried poison. The infection in his jaw had made swallowing nearly impossible. The fear in his mind made it unthinkable. By the time the court fully understood what was happening, starvation had joined infection as his executioner. This was July 1461. The 100 Years' War had effectively ended. France was reunited. English banners had been driven from the soil they had occupied for generations, and the man who had presided over that recovery now lay rotting alive in his own palace, his face collapsing, his body wasting, his mind consumed by suspicion. Only then was his name spoken openly again. Charles VII of that name to rule France. Before the infection, before the smell, before the hunger and fear, Charles had been a child shaped by catastrophe. He was born in 1403 into a kingdom already unravelling. His father, Charles VI, was alive but not ruling in any meaningful sense. Periods of lucidity alternated with terrifying episodes of madness, during which the king failed to recognise his own family, attacked members of his household, and believed himself made of glass. The court learned to function around a sovereign who could not be trusted with reality itself. Charles grew up under the long shadow of that illness. He learned early that kingship did not protect the body or the mind. He watched his mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, maneuver through factional politics simply to keep the dynasty intact. He watched Burgundians and Armagnacs tear France apart from within, while English armies pressed from without. By adolescence, he had seen enough death, betrayal and disease to understand that survival was not guaranteed by bloodline. His rise to power was neither smooth nor certain. For years he was known derisively as the King of Bourges, a monarch in name only, ruling a fraction of his inheritance while the English claimed Paris and crowned their own King of France. His legitimacy was questioned, his authority fragile, his court perpetually short of money and confidence. It was during this period that Charles learned caution. Some would later say paranoia. He trusted slowly. He listened closely. He suspected betrayal easily. In a court where poison was a familiar rumour and sudden death was not uncommon, this was not irrational. It was survival. His fortunes changed only gradually and not entirely by his own hand. The appearance of Joan of Arc, the lifting of the siege of Orleans, and his eventual coronation at Reims restored a sense of divine sanction to his rule. Over the following decades, through diplomacy, attrition and reorganization of the French military, Charles oversaw the slow expulsion of English forces from the kingdom. By the late 1450s, France was whole again in a way it had not been since his childhood. But the king himself was not. Long before the infection in his jaw announced itself in pus and stench, his body had been failing in quieter ways. Contemporary accounts speak of a chronic wound in his leg that refused to heal, an open sore that lingered for years despite treatment. Physicians debated its nature even then. Some described it as a humoral imbalance, others as a venereal corruption. Later historians would suggest diabetes, syphilis, or a combination of systemic illness that weakened his resistance to infection. Whatever its cause, The wound never closed. It festered. It drained. It marked him as a man whose flesh did not recover. By his late 50s, Charles walked with difficulty. He tired easily. He suffered recurring fevers. His immune system, though no one used that term, was visibly compromised. Minor ailments lingered longer than they should. Small injuries became major concerns. His physicians adjusted his diet, bled him, purged him, applied poultices and prayers in equal measure. Then came the tooth. The extraction was not remarkable by medieval standards. Dental pain was common, and extractions were brutal but routine. There is no record of who performed it, only that it was done and that something went wrong. The socket did not close, the area swelled. Pain intensified instead of subsiding. Within days, infection had set in. At first it was localized. Swelling beneath the jaw, heat, throbbing pain. The king complained of difficulty chewing. Physicians applied compresses, herbal washes, and cauterization. They believed the corruption could be drawn out. They were wrong. The infection spread into the soft tissues of the neck and face. Abscesses formed. The skin reddened, then darkened. Fever followed. The smell began, faint at first, then unmistakable. By late June, those closest to him could see that the left side of his face was changing shape, sagging and discoloring as the tissue beneath died. Imagine the stench of a corpse left 3 days in summer heat. Now imagine that corpse still breathing. As gangrene took hold, the skin broke down entirely in places, exposing necrotic tissue in shades of black, grey, and sickly green-yellow. Pus flowed continuously. Saliva mixed with infection and spilled from his mouth because he could no longer control it. He wiped his chin constantly, smearing foulness across his beard and chest. The court withdrew, not formally, not publicly, but distance grew. Audiences were shortened. Curtains were drawn. Servants were rotated to limit exposure. Even devotion has its limits when confronted with decomposition. Charles noticed. And as his body failed, his mind turned inward, back to the fears of his youth. His son, Louis, the Dauphin, had long since fled the court, taking refuge with the Duke of Burgundy. Their relationship was poisoned beyond repair. Charles believed, sincerely, that Louis wanted him dead, that the infection was being worsened by poison. That food was the final instrument of murder. Every tray brought into his chamber was examined, then rejected. Every cup was suspected. He would rather endure hunger than risk betrayal. Thus the convergence began. Infection destroyed his face, fear destroyed his appetite, and the King of France, master of a restored realm, began to starve. This was only the beginning. The worst was still coming. Long before his jaw began to rot, Charles had already survived what should have destroyed him. He survived a childhood lived inside a kingdom ruled by madness. His father's illness was not whispered about, it was witnessed. Courtiers saw Charles VI scream in terror at imagined enemies, fail to recognize his own wife, and attack members of his retinue with weapons drawn. For a boy raised in that court, the lesson was unavoidable. The crown did not shield the mind, and it certainly did not protect the flesh. Charles learned to observe rather than confront. While others fought openly for power, he endured. When civil war split France between Burgundian and Armagnac factions, he watched alliances fracture overnight. When the English exploited that chaos, claiming the French crown itself, he learned what it meant to be dispossessed without being dead. By his 20s he was a king without a capital, a ruler without authority, presiding over a shrinking domain while foreign armies marched unchecked. His court followed him from place to place, carrying not splendor but anxiety. Chronic stress, irregular meals, and constant movement took their toll on his health early. Letters from the period describe a man frequently unwell, withdrawn, prone to bouts of melancholy and physical exhaustion. Yet he endured. The turning point came slowly, painfully, and at great human cost. Military reforms professionalized the French army. Taxation stabilized funding. English strongholds fell one by one. Victory was not sudden, it was cumulative, grinding, and deeply exhausting. Charles was not a warrior king in the traditional sense, but he presided over a war of attrition that demanded relentless attention and political maneuvering. By the time the English were finally driven from most of France, Charles was no longer young. Decades of tension had etched themselves into his body. Chronic ailments followed him into peace. Contemporary descriptions mention recurring fevers, persistent weakness, and the leg wound that refused to heal, an open sore that physicians treated again and again without success. That wound mattered. In a pre-modern world, such lesions were not merely uncomfortable. They were signs of systemic failure. They drained strength. They invited infection. They indicated that the body's balance, its humours, was already corrupted. Physicians adjusted his regimen accordingly, but improvement never came. As peace settled over France, Charles withdrew increasingly from public life. He delegated more authority. He trusted fewer people. His relationship with his son deteriorated into hostility. Louis, brilliant, ambitious, and openly contemptuous of his father's caution, fled the court rather than submit to restraint. Their separation hardened into mutual suspicion. This personal fracture had political consequences. Ambassadors noted the king's anxiety. Courtiers whispered about poison plots. Security around his food tightened. Tasters were employed. Protocols multiplied. Fear became routine. By the late 1450s, Charles ruled a unified kingdom while feeling besieged within his own body. His physicians monitored his leg wound obsessively. His diet was restricted. Bleeding and purging were prescribed with grim regularity. Each intervention weakened him further. Then came the dental pain. At first it seemed trivial compared to everything else he had survived. A bad tooth was an annoyance, not a threat. Extraction promised relief. The decision was unremarkable. What followed was catastrophic. The king, who had survived invasion, civil war, and decades of instability, would not survive a wound inside his own mouth. Part 3. The first signs of rot. The first signs were not dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no immediate transformation of flesh. What appeared instead were the symptoms physicians of the 15th century knew well but rarely feared enough: swelling, heat, pain, and an odour that did not belong in a healthy mouth. After the tooth was pulled, the king complained that the pain had not lessened. It had sharpened. The empty socket throbbed relentlessly, a deep pulsing ache that radiated into his jaw and ear. The left side of his face grew tender to the touch. Chewing became difficult. Speech slowed. Physicians assured him this was normal. They washed the wound with herbal infusions meant to cleanse corruption. They applied compresses of warmed cloths and poultices designed to draw out bad humours. They cauterized, believing fire could halt decay. Each intervention brought brief relief, followed by worsening symptoms. Within days, the swelling had spread beyond the gum into the soft tissues beneath the jaw. The skin there grew taut and shiny. Fever followed, low at first, then persistent. The king sweated through his linens at night, shivering even as his skin burned. The smell came next. At first it was faint, noticeable only when the physicians leaned close. A sour, unpleasant odour rising from the mouth, something between infection and decay. They noted it with concern but not alarm. Infection, after all, was expected. It was believed that if corruption could be properly vented, the body would recover. But the corruption did not vent. Instead, pressure built beneath the jaw. An abscess formed, hard and painful, distorting the line of his neck. The king found it increasingly difficult to swallow. Liquids burned. Solid food caused spasms of pain so severe he recoiled from the table. Letters from the court during this period mention the king's withdrawal. Audiences were postponed. Meals were shortened. His voice grew hoarse, strained by inflammation and constant discomfort. Courtiers noticed him holding his jaw as he walked, pressing a cloth to his chin as though to contain something. By mid-June, the abscess was visible even at a distance. The skin over it reddened, then darkened. Physicians debated whether to lance it. Opening the swelling carried risks: bleeding, further infection, but leaving it closed risked worse corruption. They delayed. That delay proved fatal. As days passed, the king's fever intensified. His pulse weakened. The swelling softened ominously, a sign that the tissue beneath was dying. When the abscess finally ruptured, it did so violently. He woke choking as pus and blood flooded his mouth and throat, triggering coughing fits that left him gasping and exhausted. The relief was temporary. The drainage did not cleanse the infection, it exposed it. From that moment on, the discharge never stopped. Pus seeped constantly from the ruptured tissue. Saliva mixed with infection and spilled from his mouth because he could no longer fully close his jaw. Cloths were changed hourly. Linen stiffened as it dried. The odor intensified, filling the chamber and clinging to everyone who entered. Physicians now recognized the gravity of the situation. They spoke in hushed tones of mortification, flesh dying while the body still lived. Gangrene, though not understood in modern terms, was a known horror. Once it took hold, it was nearly impossible to reverse. They attempted everything they knew: stronger cauterization, more aggressive poultices, fasting to rebalance humors, prayers and relics brought to the bedside. Nothing slowed the spread. The skin along the left side of his face began to break down. What had been swelling became collapse. Discoloration spread in unnatural hues, black, grey, greenish-yellow, marking tissue that no longer lived. The structure of his face visibly changed, sagging as muscle and skin failed, and through it all, the king grew afraid. Not of death. He had lived with that shadow since childhood, but of betrayal. The pain distorted his thoughts, fever clouded his judgment. His long-standing suspicion of poison returned with renewed force. If his body was rotting, someone must be helping it along. Food became suspect. At first, he merely ate less. Then he refused certain dishes. Then entire meals were pushed away untouched. His physicians protested. His attendants pleaded. He would not be persuaded. Swallowing already brought agony. Now fear ensured he would not try. The infection had found its foothold. The rot was visible, and the second killer, hunger, was beginning its work. By late June, the transformation was undeniable. The left side of the king's face no longer resembled living flesh. What had begun as swelling now collapsed inward, the skin breaking apart in irregular fissures as the tissue beneath died. Contemporary descriptions spoke of a landscape of horror, a phrase that conveyed not metaphor, but observation. The face was no longer whole, it was decomposing. Gangrene had taken hold. The colour was the first unmistakable sign. Healthy skin tones vanished, replaced by blotches of grey and black edged with a sickly yellow-green sheen. These were not bruises. They did not fade or change. They spread. The odour intensified to something far worse than infection alone, a heavy, sweet, nauseating stench that announced the presence of dead tissue while the body still breathed. Imagine the smell of a corpse left exposed in summer heat. Now imagine that corpse speaking. The king could no longer control his mouth. The muscles that once held his jaw closed weakened as the infection consumed them. Saliva, pus, and blood dripped continuously onto his chest, soaking his garments and bedding. Servants placed cloths beneath his chin, changing them constantly, though the effort was futile. Within minutes, they were saturated again. Eating became nearly impossible. The mere act of opening his mouth caused pain sharp enough to make him cry out. Swallowing sent fire down his throat. Liquids choked him. Solid food was unthinkable. When he tried, the spasms left him gasping, eyes watering, body trembling with exhaustion. Physicians now understood that the infection had spread beyond any hope of simple treatment. They spoke of mortification advancing through the soft tissues, threatening the throat itself. If it reached deeper, suffocation or hemorrhage could follow. They argued over what remained to be done. Some urged more aggressive cauterization, burning away dead flesh in the hope of halting the spread. Others warned that such trauma might kill him outright. Lancing had already failed. Poultices no longer worked. Bloodletting weakened him further. Prayer was offered because nothing else remained. The king endured it all in silence or delirium. Fever consumed him. His nights were restless, punctuated by coughing fits and choking as fluid pooled in his mouth. Sleep came only in brief, fitful intervals. When awake, his eyes darted constantly, tracking every movement in the room. He believed he was being watched. The paranoia that had simmered for years now dominated his thoughts. He fixated on the idea that his son, still estranged and absent, had arranged this, that the infection was not natural, that poison had been introduced through food or drink, and that the jaw wound was merely the visible symptom of a deeper plot. No reassurance could reach him. The more attendants insisted on nourishment, the more convinced he became that they were complicit. Food trays were waved away, cups were left untouched. Even water was viewed with suspicion. As days passed, the effects of starvation compounded the infection. His face hollowed, his limbs thinned, his strength faded rapidly. He could no longer sit upright without assistance. Speaking exhausted him. His voice, once steady, now emerged hoarse and weak, distorted by swelling and pain. The court reacted with quiet panic. Access to the king was tightly controlled, not only to preserve dignity, but to limit exposure to the smell and the spectacle. Diplomats were kept away, decisions were delayed, power stagnated as the body at its centre failed. Rumours spread through the palace and beyond. Some spoke openly of divine punishment. Others whispered that the king was already dead in all but name. Physicians recorded what they could, aware they were witnessing a terminal decline. Their notes described tissue sloughing away, the impossibility of cleansing the wound, the relentless progression despite all efforts. They did not use the language of inevitability, but it was implied. The face that had once presided over a reunited France was dissolving. And with every passing hour, the convergence tightened, infection advancing upward and inward, hunger draining what little strength remained, fear sealing his refusal to eat. Part V. Fear, physicians, and poison. By early July, the king no longer ruled in any meaningful sense. His body lay at the centre of the court, but authority radiated outward only weakly, distorted by illness and fear. Decisions stalled. Messages went unanswered. Ministers conferred in adjoining chambers, speaking in lowered voices, uncertain whether the man behind the closed doors would live through the day, or whether he was still capable of understanding what they said. The physicians had reached the limits of their art. They came daily, sometimes twice, sometimes more, though each visit followed the same grim pattern. They examined the face, now partially collapsed on the left side where tissue had sloughed away entirely. They noted the expanding margins of dead flesh, the foul discharge that could not be stopped, the fever that rose and fell without pattern. They argued quietly over treatments they already knew would fail. One recommended stronger cauterization, reasoning that only fire could halt corruption so advanced. Another objected, warning that the king's weakened state would not survive such trauma. A third suggested purging and bleeding to rebalance the humours, despite clear evidence that each such intervention left him weaker. None of them spoke openly of hope. They applied poultices anyway. They burned incense and herbs to mask the smell, and symbolically to purify the air. They prayed aloud in his presence, hoping divine intervention might succeed where medicine could not. Relics were brought into the chamber. Holy water was sprinkled on the linens already soaked with pus. The king watched all of this with hollow eyes. His fevered mind clung to a single conviction. This was not merely illness. This was murder. He fixated on poison with obsessive intensity. Every cup, every spoon, every piece of bread became suspect. He interrogated servants weekly, demanding to know who had prepared his food, who had touched it, who had entered the kitchens. Long-standing precautions, tasters, sealed vessels, controlled access, were no longer enough. He believed the plot ran deeper. The name he did not need to speak was his son's. Louis the Dauphin remained absent, allied with Burgundy, politically hostile and personally estranged. For years Charles had feared that Louis would not wait for nature to remove him. Now, as his own body decayed, that fear crystallized into certainty. In his mind, the jaw infection was proof that the attempt was already underway. The physician's insistence that he eat only reinforced his suspicion. Why were they so eager? Why did they press him so urgently? Why did they insist on nourishment when swallowing caused such agony? He refused. At first he allowed thin broths, then rejected those as well. Even water became suspect. His intake dwindled to almost nothing. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, but fear overpowered it. Better to starve than to be poisoned. Starvation began to leave its marks. His cheeks hollowed further, sharpening the contrast between living tissue and the dead zones consuming his face. His limbs thinned rapidly, muscle wasted. His strength ebbed with alarming speed. He could no longer stand. He could barely sit, propped by cushions. Speaking exhausted him within moments. The infection advanced unchecked. Without nourishment, his body lost what little ability it had to resist. The margins of gangrene spread. The wound oozed continuously. The smell grew so intense that attendants struggled to remain in the room. Some gagged openly despite their training and loyalty. Others begged to be reassigned. Linen was changed constantly, yet the stench clung to walls, furniture, and skin. The court responded by retreating further. Visitors were restricted. Curtains remained drawn. The king's chamber became a place of isolation, both to preserve dignity and to contain the sensory horror unfolding within. Those who entered did so out of duty, not hope. Outside, rumours flourished. Some claimed the king was already dead and being kept hidden. Others said he had been struck by divine punishment. Still others whispered that the Dauphin's hand was indeed at work. No official statement contradicted them. The silence itself fed speculation. Inside the chamber, time blurred. Days passed without nourishment. Fever and hunger intertwined, producing delirium. The king drifted in and out of consciousness. At times he muttered accusations. At others he lay silent, eyes fixed on nothing, breath shallow and uneven. The physicians now understood the truth. They could not speak aloud. Even if the infection miraculously halted, starvation alone would kill him. The convergence was complete. The end did not arrive with ceremony. There was no final audience, no last proclamation, no moment of clarity in which the king understood what was happening to him. What remained was only physical failure, progressing hour by hour, visible to everyone in the room. By mid-July, Charles had not eaten for days. His body, already ravaged by infection, began consuming itself. Fat vanished first, then muscle. His breathing grew shallow and irregular, interrupted by wet coughing as infected fluid pooled in his throat. The effort of drawing air across swollen, decaying tissue exhausted him. Each breath was work. The gangrene continued its advance. Dead flesh separated from living tissue and sloughed away, exposing raw surfaces beneath. The smell was no longer merely nauseating. It was overwhelming, inescapable, the unmistakable odour of death arriving early. Attendants kept their faces turned away when possible, not out of disrespect, but necessity. He was too weak now to refuse food with words. When broth was brought, he turned his head slightly, a minimal gesture, but unmistakable. Fear still governed what little will remained. Poison, real or imagined, mattered more to him than survival. The physicians no longer debated treatment. They observed, they recorded, they waited. His pulse weakened, his skin cooled. Fever gave way to a strange calm, the body surrendering what it could no longer defend. When consciousness returned, it was fleeting. His eyes opened without focus. His mouth moved without sound. The infection had destroyed too much. On July 22nd, 1461, Charles VII of France died. He was 58 years old. No wound had struck him down. No enemy had breached his chamber. The king who had survived invasion, civil war, and decades of instability succumbed to a tooth extraction, an infection, and his own terror of betrayal. He is remembered as the only king of France to have died of starvation, not from poverty, but from fear and physical collapse. Within hours, his son returned to claim the throne. History would record Charles as a restorer of France, a cautious ruler who brought a shattered kingdom back from the edge. What it often softens or omits entirely is how little that power mattered when his body began to fail. The crown did not stop the rot. The palace did not keep death out. And in the end, authority could not force a dying man to swallow.